In this video, I'm going to show you how to master using arrays, collections and dictionaries in VBA. If you can grasp what I've covered in this video, then you are well on your way to becoming an advanced VBA user. Now make sure to download the code from the link in the description below so that you can try out the examples for yourself. We're going to look at using arrays first. So in Excel, we often have data like this, and we often read it using VBA. Now the typical way that we read this data is by using a range. So let's have a look at the code for this. So the way we read this data is by declaring a range variable like this, and then we set the range variable to the range that we want to read the data from. So we're going to use current region here, and what current region does is it gives us back all the adjacent data. So now once we've got the range, we read through it using a for loop. We say for I equals 1, 2, and that's range rows.count, so the number of rows that we have. And then we close our for loop here. And now to access any item on a particular row, what we use is range, and we use cells. I is the current row, and then we use the number of whatever field we want. So we're going to take column 1 and we're going to take column 2. Now when we run this code, what we get is the day and the salesperson. So you can see we got the results of column 1 and column 2. The problem with using this method is that using range is extremely slow for reading data. So what we do instead is use an array. So we declare the array as a variable, and then we assign the array to our range, and not only just the range, we say to the value of the range. So we're using value to because it's the fastest way of accessing the values. And now VBA will automatically create an array from all the values in a range. So we can read through it like this. We use L-bound array 1, which is the first item in our array, and U-bound array 1, which is the last item. Now, these just deal with rows. If we use number 2, it deals with columns. So to access something, we simply use the array, and we're basically using the row and the column. So I is the row, 1 and 2 are the column. If we run the code again, what you'll see is that we'll get exactly the same results, but our code will run a lot faster because we're using arrays. And this can make a significant difference if you're using a large amount of data. Just like we can read from the range to an array, we can also read from the array back to the range. And this is how we do it. We simply assign it to the array. Now the difference here is that when we assign the range, we've got to resize the range so it matches the size of our array. So we use the resize function to do this. And then we use U-bound array 1, which gives us the number of rows, and U-bound array 2, which gives us the number of columns. So in terms of array, this is basically the first dimension and the second dimension. And when we run the code, you can see that it wrote out all the data to the column starting at column F. Being told how to use the array is one thing, but to really understand it, it's a good idea if we look at a real-world example. So let's look at a simple example where we take this data here and filter it by the salesperson Jenny. And the results will look like this. So let's go ahead and start writing the code. The first thing we do is list out all the tasks. So we can list them out as comments, as you see here. So the first one we want to do is get the range and place it in an array. Then we're going to store the row and column size in a variable, and that's just to make the code more readable. And then we're going to create the output array. After that, we're going to read through the data and we're going to filter the data. So how we filter the data is by checking if the salesperson is Jenny. And if the salesperson is Jenny, we're going to copy that row to the output array. And then finally, what we're going to do is write out the array to the worksheet. So now that we have a list of our tasks, we can approach them one at a time. The first thing that we'll do is we'll declare our array as a variant, and then we'll assign it to a range. So in other words, this will copy all the data from the range to our array, and it will automatically dimension, as in set the size of the array to the size that we want. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to store the row and column in a variable. And the reason we're doing this is it just makes the code a bit more readable. So rather than having U-bounds everywhere, we can just say row count equals U-bound array 1. And column count is U-bound array 2. So U-bound basically gives the number of items in a particular dimension in an array. Now we're going to have an output array, and that's the array we're going to be writing out to the range. So every time we find a row, we're going to put it in this array. And we set this to the size of the current array, because we know that it's not going to be bigger than this. And in the end, we're only going to write out the records that we find. We're not going to write out the entire array. So we use the for loop to read through the records. So 1 to row count, And then we'll terminate our for loop down here with the next I. So then we declare our variables. We want to have dim I as long, and that's for our for loop. And we want to have the salesperson as well. So the salesperson, again, we're just using this to make the code more readable. So salesperson will equal array I2, which is the second column of the current row. Now using this, as I said, makes the code more readable, but it also makes the code run a bit faster if you're dealing with a huge amount of data. And then we say, if salesperson equals Jenny, so we're filtering here, we want to add this row to the new array. Now we need to track the row that we're going to write out to the output array. So we use the variable current row. This starts at 0, and every time we find a record, we add 1 to it. So the first time it'll be 1, the second time 2, and so on. So we declare this as a long, and we explicitly set it to 0. Now it's automatically 0 by default, but it's always good to explicitly state what we're doing in our code. And then to copy the row, we use a for loop. And the for loop reads across through our columns. And we start by saying output array. So it's output array current row. So that's the variable we just had. And it's the current column. So column J. And then with array, it's the current row that we're reading through, which is I, and then the column, which is J. And that will copy the row to the output array. We just declare J as our variable up here. Then we terminate our if statement. Now to see if our code is working so far, we run it and we stop it at the breakpoint at the end. And then we click on output array and press Shift F9 and click add, and this will add a watch to our watch window. Now we can double click on the watch window to bring it up here. And then what we'll do is we'll look through each of the items in the array. So the first item you can see is the row 1 with Jenny. The second is number 2, and the third one is number 5. You can see the fourth one is empty. So it's brought us back 3 rows and put them in our output array. And this is exactly what we're expecting. Before we write out the data to the spreadsheet, we should write code to clear any pre-existing data. So we clear the spreadsheet by using current region, and that gives us all the adjacent data, but we do offset 1, which essentially moves the range down 1 row. It moves it off the header, and then we clear the contents. So let's try it here by putting in some temporary data. And we run the code, and you'll see that it gave us back the empty spaces as we expected. So it removed all the existing data. Now we're going to write it out by doing sheet data range, and we start on F2. So we're going to write a range from F2, and we resize a range to the size we want. So we use current row to write out the number of rows, and this means it's only writing out the number of rows that we've added to our output array. So we're not writing out the entire array. And the number of columns is the number of columns in the output array. So that's U-bound output array 2. And we simply assign this then to our output array. So we use value 2 because value 2 is the quickest way of writing out the data. So we run the code, and you can see that we got the results. We've got all the rows with Jenny written out to the range starting at F2. This is the code we use to filter data using an array. Now don't worry if the code is a bit complicated, because when we use an array, we pretty much use similar code to this all the time. And you can also download this code from the description below the video and try it out for yourself. Now that we've seen how arrays work in VBA, let's compare them to dictionaries and collections and see how they differ. An array is simply a row of data items in memory. When we are dealing with worksheets, we use a two-dimensional array, which is essentially a grid of data items similar to a worksheet range. Their dictionary is a bit different. It also stores data items, however each item also comes with a unique key. The purpose of the key is to allow the user to quickly access a data item. For example, in a real-world dictionary, we have a list of words which are keys, and each word has a definition, which is the value. The main difference between using a dictionary and an array is that we typically use an array when we want to read through each item in our data, and we use a dictionary when we want to retrieve individual values. A collection is similar to the dictionary but has a few differences, with the main ones being as follows. The keys in a dictionary are optional. You cannot change a value if the basic type is like a string or a long. One useful thing you can do with a collection is to insert an item in a specific position, which is useful if you want to emulate a stack or a queue. Now the easiest way to understand these structures is to see them in action, and we're going to have a look at some real-world examples so you can see exactly which is the best one for each situation. In this example, we want to get the unique names from a list of 200,000. Now in this example, there's 97 unique names and we want to extract them from the 200,000 data items. So we're going to do it first with an array, and then we'll do it with a collection and a dictionary, and we'll compare the code for all three and we'll see which method is the fastest. Now we're going to start with this code because we've already used this in our first example. What we do with the array is we get the range, we create the output array, we read through the data, and then we write out the data. Now the difference here is which data that we're going to be extracting. So in this case, we want to check what the last name is. So first of all, we say last name equals array I1. We put it in a variable because it's more readable and it's more efficient if we're referencing this multiple times. And we're going to create a function exists in array. And what we do is we pass that function the output array. We want to see if the item exists in this output array. We want to give it the last name, which is the item we're checking for. And we want to give it current row because we're basically telling it only check to this row. Otherwise, it doesn't know where to stop and it'll read through the entire array, which is very inefficient. So if it exists in the array, we simply put the value in our output array at the current row position. So we just say that equals last name, and before that, we move current row to the next row. So current row, like in our previous example, starts at 0. When we find the first item, we set it to 1, the second item 2, and so on. Now this is our exists in array function. This will return true or false based on if the item exists or if the item doesn't exist in our output array. So in other words, if we've seen it already. So we read through the array, we start at 1 and we read until the current row. So if we've only got one item in the array, it'll just read to position 1. And it'll basically check everything in the array to see if the item exists. So we're just, again, doing a simple comparison. We're saying if that in the array equals the value, then what we want to do is return true. So that's basically saying it exists in the array. Otherwise, it will return false. Now a Boolean function will always return false by default, so we don't actually have to set exists in array to anything. It'll be false unless we set it to true. Now let's just change our resize here, current row 1, and now we're going to write out the data. So we're going to write out the data, and this is going to be written out to A2. You see when we ran the code that we got the output to A2. Now if we scroll to the end, you can see it goes down to 98, so it wrote us out the 97 unique values. And that's how we extract unique values from a list using an array. If we look at the timings for the array, you can see that as we add more unique values, that the performance degrades considerably. And this is because when we have the array, it means we've got more and more lookups to do, and it takes longer and longer. A quick pause to tell you about the Excel VBA Handbook course. Are you struggling to build VBA applications? Do you find it difficult to get good information on how to create real-world VBA code? Is it a struggle every time you try to create a VBA application, no matter how simple it is? Well, the Excel VBA Handbook course teaches how to build real-world Excel VBA applications from scratch. Unlike most courses, you won't be overwhelmed with information and left to figure out how to put it all together. Instead, you'll be taken step by step through 10 Excel VBA applications with every concept explained. Once you start working through VBA applications, you'll be amazed how quickly your VBA skills increase. So check out the VBA Handbook course at theexcelvbahandbook.com, and the link can also be found in the description below the video. We can make a slight adjustment to this code and it will work a bit faster for this particular application. So instead of declaring a two-dimensional array, we declare a one-dimensional array. So for this, I was doing output in a two-dimensional array with one column, and now I'm just going to make it a one-dimensional array. And you see that we have everything set to 1. Now, what this means is that if it's a one-dimensional array, it's usually in row format. So you can see here that when we write it out, it just writes out the first item multiple times. So what we actually have to do is we have to transpose the array. So we use worksheet function transpose to do this. Now keep in mind that the maximum values you can have in the array when you're trying to transpose is 64,000. Now in our case there's no problem, but it's just important to understand if you're going to be working with transpose. When we run the code, you can see that we got the same results as in our previous method. Now it's important to understand this method because some functions in VBA like join will return an array, and so it's important to know how to write the array to the worksheet. Before we get started with the collection example, let's look at the basics of a collection. So we declare a collection like this, and what you'll notice is that we never have to specify the size. VBA takes care of this for us. So you simply just add the item that you want, and VBA will automatically resize it and do whatever housekeeping is needed to be done under the hood. Now to retrieve the item, we simply specify the position, and I've specified 1 and 2 here. So when we run this code, you'll see that it retrieved apple and orange. You can see them in the immediate window. Now if we want to retrieve all the items in the collection, we can run through the collection using a for loop. So we can use the standard for I loop like this, or we can use the for each loop. Now the for each loop is much quicker, but the for I loop means that we have a counter so we can access items if we need to. So it depends on specific circumstances. Now we run the code here, you can see printed out the entire contents of our collection, which is simply apple and orange. Now what most people don't realize is that when we add an item to a collection, we can also add a key. It's optional, but we can use it if we want. So in this case, I'm adding a key, which is the product ID, and I'm giving this one product ID 001 and the second 002. And now to retrieve the item, we can use these keys. So you can see in the second add that I've added item and key to the parameter names just to make it clear. Now when you're using a dictionary, they're actually parameters are in reverse. So here we are using the keys, and when we run the code, the debug print will print out apple and orange. So it used the key. Now the disadvantage with the collection is that we can check if the key exists, and the second item is that we can't run through a list of the keys, and that's why the dictionary is generally better. So let's go ahead and get started using the collection in our first example. So we've seen how to use the array to get the unique names from a list. Now we're going to use the collection. And you can see most of the code is the very same. We're going to get the range into an array and so on. So we declare our collection first of all. And the next thing that we do within our loop, we're going to add the item to our collection. But we're going to add the name as an item and as a key. And the idea is if we try and add a duplicate key, it will give us an error and it won't work. Now, we don't want the code to stop in an error. So what we do is on error, resume next. And this isn't really ideal because we're basically saying if there's an error, keep going, whereas there could be an error on a different line. But we don't have an exist function in collection, so this is what we have to do. Now we could, when we're writing out the collection, we could read through the collection and write it out through the worksheet, but that's quite slow to do. So what we do instead is we write it to an array, and then we'll write the whole array out to the range. Now you might say, why don't we just use an array in the first place, just to do everything like we did before? But it's actually quicker to use the collection, as we'll see, because the method of adding the collection and not having to cycle through the array is actually much quicker. We read through the collection and then we just assign whatever the current value in the column to our output array. And then what we'll do is we'll write the output array to the worksheet just like we've done in our previous examples. And when we run the code, you can see that it's written out all the values right down to 98. And so the collection works very well. And now if we look at the speed, you can see what the speed was like for the collection. And you can see that it's significantly faster than when we were using arrays. Now let's look at how we'd approach the same problem using a dictionary. Let's have a quick look at the basics of a dictionary so we know what we're dealing with. Now we go to Tools, References, and we click on Microsoft Scripting Runtime. And the reason for this is because dictionary is an external library. It's not actually part of VBA, but we still have full access to it. Now, instead of using collection, obviously we're going to use dictionary, and I'm going to replace the variable COLL with DICT. So it's obvious in our code that we're dealing with a dictionary. Now the code we're left with is the same code that we used for a collection earlier, and when we run the code you'll see there's no errors, but it doesn't print out apple. The reason for this is that with the collection the item comes first and the key comes second, but with the dictionary it's in reverse order. So we'll reverse these and we'll run the code again, and this time when we run the code you'll see that it retrieved the items as we expected from their keys. So we got apple and orange. Now when we're using a dictionary, one other difference is that the key is mandatory. We have to have a key. So if we don't provide two parameters, say for example we take out apple and we run the code, we'll get the error argument not optional. So we always have to have a key and an item with a dictionary. Now another thing that we have in the dictionary that we don't have in the collection is we have the exists function. And in this code that I'm writing here, you can see that we can use exists to check if a key already exists in our dictionary. Now, when we run this code, it writes out the product key if the product key exists. So I'm putting in an invalid product key, and you'll see it gave me the message box that product 009 does not exist. If we want to read through all the items in a collection, for example, all the keys, we can do so like this. We use the for each key in the dictionary. Using dict will give us back dictionary keys, the collection of all the items, and then we can print out the key and then use that key to give us the item. When we run this code, you'll see that it prints out all the keys and their associated items. So this is very useful when we're using the dictionary. So now we're going to try this example of getting back unique values using the dictionary instead of using the collection or the arrays. So first of all, we declare our dictionary and we make sure obviously that we have the reference set to scripting dictionary. And what we're going to do is we check if the last name exists. And if this is false, so if it doesn't exist, what we want to do is we want to add it to our dictionary. And we're just going to add an item of 0 because all we're going to be using is the keys. We don't care about the items for this particular example. So if it doesn't exist, we simply add it. Otherwise, we simply ignore it. Now, when we're writing out the dictionary, we can actually write out the dictionary keys and the dictionary items straight to the worksheet because they're actually arrays. But we need to transpose because, as we saw already, one-dimensional arrays needs to be transposed because a one-dimensional array is a row. So the dictionary keys is an array and we can write that straight out to our range. So we run the code and you'll see it gave us back the results. So what you might notice is that it took very little code with the dictionary compared to using the collection or the arrays. And not only that, but if we look at the speed, you can see that the dictionary is much faster than using the collections and the array. So the dictionary is definitely the best for this one. Now we're going to look at our third example. And in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to sum the values of each of the salespeople. So we're going to get all the totals. So this is similar to how we create a pivot table. Now, how are we going to do this and which is the best method to use? Well, we've seen already that arrays is quite slow when we're trying to retrieve a value. And we can't use collections for this because collections don't allow us to change the value. So we can't change the value of a basic type in a collection. So this means that the dictionary is our best option. So let's look at the code and see how we'll use the dictionary to complete this task. So this is the code we have. So pretty similar to what we've seen before. We put all the data from a range into an array and then we read through that array. Now you can see that we've got salesperson in column 2 and sales amount in column 4. So let's declare our dictionary like this. And as always, when we use a dictionary, make sure that we have scripting runtime turned on in our references. Now what we say is, if the salesperson exists in this dictionary, what we want to do is we want to add to their value. So if exists equals true, we take the value at that key. So give us back the value for that salesperson and then add the sales amount to it. And then we place it all back in the value at the key. Now, if the person doesn't exist, so the salesperson isn't in the dictionary, what we do is we just add it with the current sales amount. Now, we're going to refine this a bit shortly, but let's go with this for the moment. And then to write out the items here, what we basically do is we use the dictionary keys and the dictionary items. Now, one thing that we must remember when we use these two arrays, so dictionary keys is an array and dictionary items is an array. And one thing that we must keep in mind is that they're one-dimensional arrays. So as we've seen, that means that they write to the row on a worksheet. So if we want them to write to the column, we've got to use worksheet function transpose. Now there's a limit to this. It only goes to 64,000. So keep that in mind if you're using worksheet function transpose. So when we run the code, what you'll see is that we got the results that we had expected. So this is how we sum the values using the dictionary. Now I'm going to refine the code to make it even better. So we actually don't need to check if the person exists in this dictionary. And the reason for this is that if you look here, this one line will actually do it all for us. So if the person doesn't exist in the dictionary, this line automatically puts it in the dictionary for us. So this is really good because we don't need all the extra code to check. So we run the code again and you'll see that what we got was the results that we expected. And we've just one line of code to add the item to the dictionary, whether it's there or not. So you can see how useful this is. This example is very similar to the last one, but this time what we want to do is we want to sum both the volume and the amount columns. Now this is a bit trickier because the dictionary can only store one item per key. So we want to sum two items. So that makes it that little bit more difficult. So how do we approach doing this? Well, we approach doing this by using a dictionary. What we do is the dictionary stores the ID or the position in the output array. So let's look at an example of what I mean. When we read through the first record here, which is Jenny, what we do is we put Jenny as the key, but we put the value as our ID. And so we're putting 1, and then in position 1 we're going to put Jenny. And then what we do is we add the volume and the amount for Jenny. Now we come to the next record, Bill. We check does Bill exist in the dictionary, and if he doesn't, we enter him and we give him the next position, which is 2, and then we enter that position in the array. So we can always reference Bill in the array by looking at his value. And then John, we do the same. Doesn't exist, we add him to our array, and then we add values to his current value. And the current value obviously is 0 the first time. Now this time we're meeting Bill again, and we've checked if Bill exists, and he does. So we use the value 2 to go to the position in the array, and then we simply update his values in the array. Now the beauty of this is that at the end we've got an array, and all we have to do is write out our array just like we did before, and we can write it straight out to the worksheet. Let's start writing the code. Now the first thing we do is we declare our dictionary. So using new here, we create our new dictionary so we can start adding to it. Now we're going to create a variable, and this variable tracks the new row ID. Now the first ID will be 1, the second will be 2, and so on. And this is simply where we put them in the array. And we'll use output row ID when we're accessing a row ID from the dictionary. So it's basically the current output row ID. Now what we do first of all here is we say if the item already exists in the dictionary. So we check if our salesperson exists in the dictionary. Now if they don't exist in the dictionary, what we want to do is first of all we want to get a new row ID. So that means we just simply add 1 to the new row ID. So it starts at 0, so now the new row ID is 1. We add the salesperson as the key, and then we add the row as the item. So the row is the value. And then what we do is we add the details to our output array. So at the new row ID position, we're going to add the salesperson's name. And this goes into column 1. And column 2 and 3 will hold the further values, which will be the volume and the amount. So now we're down here, we'll say output a row ID, give us the output row ID, and this gives us the value on a given salesperson. So the idea here is that if it already exists, output row ID will give us the salesperson, and if we've just added, it will give us the value at the salesperson as well. So output array now equals what's currently in that position, but we add what's in the array. So we're basically adding what's in the current volume and what's in the current amount to that position in the array. So this is similar to what we did in the last one. It's just slightly different how we position it with the dictionary and with the array. And that's all there is to the code. So for something that seems quite complicated, actually implementing the code is very, very simple. So let's run the code and look at the results. And you can see that we got the results that we expected. We got the totals for the volume and the total for the amount. After seeing these examples, it's a good idea to really get to know the dictionary, and if you check out my playlist here, it covers everything that you need to know.